morning, a chilling confession brings a close to a child kidnapping case that made national headlines nearly 3 decades ago. Danny Heinrich admitted yesterday to killing 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling in 1989. Jacob's parents learned details about their son's final hours as they watched the confession from the front row of a Minnesota courtroom.
He's face down on gravel. Cold road, no streetlights, October dark. The kind of dark you only get a half-mile outside a small town where nobody thought to be afraid yet. 20 minutes earlier, a man had backed his car into a driveway along this road, killed his headlights, and waited. He didn't know the boys who would ride past. He'd never seen them before tonight. He just knew the road, and he knew kids used it after dark without a second thought, because that's what this town had always let them do. When 3 sets of bike lights came bouncing around the bend, he stepped out into the road wearing a mask, a revolver in his hand. He ordered all 3 boys down onto the gravel, face first, and told 2 of them one thing only: run, and don't look back. They ran. They didn't stop to check if anyone was behind them until they were pounding on a neighbor's door, gasping, unable to get the words out fast enough. The 3rd boy stayed on the ground, 11 years old, and by every account of what happened in the seconds after his friends disappeared into the dark, the only question he thought to ask the man standing over him wasn't "Who are you?" It was, "What did I do wrong?" There was no answer to give him, because he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd ridden his bike to the video store on a Sunday night with his little brother and his best friend, rented a comedy, bought some candy, and started the ride home, the way kids in this town had always been allowed to do. His name was Jacob Wetterling, and the truth of what happened to him that night wouldn't be confirmed. Not to his family, not to the public, not even out loud by the man responsible, for 27 years. If you're new here, we dig into real cases with real documents and real consequences, and this one has a gut punch of an ending, so stick around for it. Drop where you're watching from in the comments. We actually read them. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the most disturbing part of this story isn't the abduction, it's everything that happened after it. Jacob Erwin Wetterling was born in February of 1978 in central Minnesota, the second of 4 kids, with an older sister and a younger brother and sister behind him. The family lived in St. Joseph, a small town outside St. Cloud. The kind of place where the biggest safety concern parents had was making sure their kids wore something reflective on their bikes at night, not that anyone would deliberately hurt them. His father ran a local chiropractic practice. His mother held the household together. People who knew Jacob describe him the same way, decades later, without much variation. Warm, funny, the kind of kid who made adults want to be better around him. On the night of October 22nd, 1989, Jacob's parents were out for the evening. Jacob, his younger brother, and his best friend called home bored and asked permission to ride to the corner store to rent a movie. The first answer was no. They asked again. This time, permission came with conditions. Wear something reflective. Bring a flashlight. Stay together the entire way there and back. The fear, if there was one, was that a passing car might not see 3 boys on bikes in the dark. Nobody imagined the danger might be a person, parked and waiting, with nothing to do that night but watch the road for exactly this. The boys made the ride into town without incident, picked out a comedy, grabbed some snacks, and started home. It was a moonless night, and the stretch of road outside town had no lighting at all, just 3 thin beams cutting through total darkness. The man had already picked his spot. He'd pulled into a driveway along the route roughly 20 minutes earlier, cut his headlights, and waited for the boys to come back the way they'd gone. When he saw their lights approaching, he put on a mask, stepped into the road with a revolver, and forced all 3 boys to lie face down on the gravel. He told 2 of them to run without looking back. They obeyed, sprinting the better part of a mile to reach a neighbor who was babysitting Jacob's younger sister. The call went out immediately. Police arrived at the scene within minutes and found 3 bicycles abandoned in the road. They did not find Jacob. What actually happened to him in the hours that followed wouldn't be known to anyone outside one man for nearly 3 decades. He forced Jacob into his car. He drove him to an isolated area near a gravel pit. He sexually assaulted him, and at some point, listening to police radio chatter on a scanner in his own vehicle, and believing officers were closing in, he panicked, and he shot Jacob and buried him. Over the following years, more than 500,000 tips would pour in from across the country. It became one of the largest search efforts in Minnesota's history. Volunteers combing fields, billboards with Jacob's face on interstates 1,000 miles away, a task force that never fully disbanded, and somewhere underneath the entire machinery of that search, the actual answer had already happened, in full, within the first several hours of the very first night, long before most of the people looking for him had even begun. Every case we cover here takes real digging, court records, investigative files, the stuff that usually stays buried. If this one's already got you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because it only gets harder to sit with from here. Now let's talk about how close investigators actually got, and how they let it slip away. Less than 2 days after Jacob disappeared, a local teenager walked into the county sheriff's office with his father and asked to speak to an investigator. He said that over the previous 2 years, there had been a string of similar attacks on boys in a nearby town. Kids grabbed off their bikes at gunpoint, the assaults carried out with an unsettling, almost disciplined precision. He thought the pattern sounded exactly like what had just happened to Jacob, and he gave investigators a name to start pulling on. That lead sat untouched for nearly 3 months. When investigators finally followed it, in January of 1990, it led them directly to a man named Danny Heinrich, already a person of interest in that earlier string of assaults in the neighboring town. And there was more waiting in the file already. 9 months before Jacob was taken, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Shirel had been abducted while walking home in a nearby community. A man forced him into a car, drove him somewhere remote, sexually assaulted him, and released him with an order to run and not look back. Almost the identical phrasing used the night Jacob was taken. Because that boy survived, he could describe his attacker's voice, his car, his clothing. Investigators searched Heinrich's home in January of 1990 and placed him in a photo lineup. The following month, they arrested him in connection with that earlier assault, but didn't have enough at the time to formally charge him. Around that same window, investigators had taken plaster casts of footprints and tire tracks recovered from the driveway where the man had waited for Jacob. An FBI analysis in 1990 found that those prints and tracks shared characteristics with Danny Heinrich's own vehicle and shoes. He couldn't be ruled out. And then, somehow, his name simply stopped appearing in the file. For more than 20 years, Danny Heinrich does not meaningfully resurface anywhere in the Wetterling investigation. Of everything eventually made public from that file, the overwhelming majority of it was generated in just the first 2 years, before the trail was allowed to go cold, not because the evidence ran out, but because nobody followed the thread that was already sitting in the box. One investigator who reviewed the file decades later put it as plainly as it can be put. When you go through this case, you should have thought of him. Nobody had a good answer for why they hadn't. With the strongest lead sitting untouched, the investigation eventually drifted somewhere else entirely. In 2004, after a separate, unrelated set of tire tracks was identified near the abduction site, suspicion turned toward a local school band teacher whose family farm sat at the end of the very driveway where Jacob had been taken. The driver actually connected to those particular tracks was ruled out fairly quickly, but the shadow of suspicion over that innocent man never fully lifted. He submitted to a polygraph. He submitted to hypnosis. He submitted to DNA testing. All of it came back clean, and none of it cleared his name in the public eye. In 2010, the sitting sheriff named him publicly as a person of interest. Investigators dug up sections of his family's farm looking for remains. He would not be cleared until 2016, the very same week the real killer finally confessed. Sit with that for a second, because it matters. The footprint and tire track evidence tying Danny Heinrich to that same driveway had been sitting in the case file since 1989 and 1990. The case sat frozen like that for a generation, and then it cracked open almost by accident, from a direction nobody expected. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a story that resolves the way you want it to, so tell us in the comments what you'd have done differently with that first tip. It's the kind of thing that's easy to say from the outside and brutal to live with from the inside. In July of 2015, investigators executed a search warrant on Danny Heinrich's home, still, after all those years, quietly working both the Wetterling and Shirel cases in the background. What they found inside had nothing directly to do with either one. child sexual abuse material, organized into multiple binders throughout the house, along with more stored on a hard drive in the basement. When officers approached him at his job at a local plywood plant, he was strikingly calm. Asked how he was doing, he said not too bad. He showed a flash of anger reading the search warrant, but agreed without much resistance to go home with them. For 5 hours, he sat at a picnic table in his own backyard while the search was carried out, drinking a beer, talking with the officers almost casually. At one point, before they'd found anything, he told them they would. He was arrested and charged on the exploitation material alone, charges serious enough, on their own, to put him away for the rest of his life. And for nearly a year afterward, he said nothing at all about Jacob. Behind the scenes, federal prosecutors and Heinrich's defense team spent months negotiating something almost without precedent in a case like this, an agreement that could only move forward with the Wetterling family's direct approval. In exchange for a complete, on-the-record confession to Jacob's murder, and for leading investigators to the location of his remains, prosecutors agreed not to pursue a murder charge at all. He would be sentenced solely on the exploitation material charge, the maximum the law allowed for that offense alone, 20 years. It took most of a year of on-again, off-again contact before Heinrich actually agreed to the terms. Prosecutors later described him as volatile, willing to talk one day, silent the next, and they knew the deal could collapse at any moment right up until it didn't. The agreement was finalized on August 30th, 2016. Within days, Heinrich led authorities to a rural field near a gravel pit outside the town of Paynesville. On September 1st, investigators recovered human remains from a pasture there. 2 days later, dental records confirmed what 27 years of hope and dread had circled without ever quite landing on. It was Jacob. On September 6, 2016, Danny Heinrich stood in a federal courtroom and pleaded guilty to 1 count related to the exploitation material found in his home. As a condition of the plea, under oath, in open court, he described what he had done that October night. He said he'd been driving and spotted 3 boys biking with a flashlight. He pulled into a nearby driveway and waited roughly 20 minutes. He put on a mask, grabbed a revolver, and stepped into the road to meet them. He told 2 of the boys to run. He forced Jacob into his car and restrained him. He drove him to a remote area near a gravel pit and sexually assaulted him. He had a police scanner in his own vehicle, and when he heard officers responding nearby, he panicked, and he shot Jacob and buried him. A year later, worried the location wasn't secure, he dug up the remains and reburied them in the field where they'd eventually be found. In that same hearing, he also admitted to the earlier assault of Jared Shirel. There was no trial, no jury, no verdict would ever exist for the killing itself, only a confession, given freely, with no charge hanging over the one crime it actually described. Jacob's mother spoke to reporters afterward, her voice breaking as she talked about what her son had taught the people around him, how to love, how to be kind, how his legacy had outgrown the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Sentencing came 9 weeks later, in November, and this was where the family finally stood in front of the man who'd taken their son and spoke directly to him. Jacob's father began, almost unbelievably, by thanking Heinrich for finally saying where Jacob was. He talked about what nearly 3 decades of not knowing had done to his marriage, how the not knowing had been so heavy at times that he and his wife struggled to even be there for each other. Jacob's older sister spoke about finally learning the details of her brother's last hours, and about the decades Heinrich had let the family believe they might still see Jacob again. By multiple accounts, Heinrich wiped away tears while she spoke. Jacob's mother spoke last, before Heinrich addressed the court himself, telling him plainly that there were no words large enough for what he had taken from her family, every single day since. She told him he hadn't needed to hurt her son, that Jacob had done nothing wrong, that he only wanted to go home. When Heinrich spoke, he said he was truly sorry for what he'd done. The prosecutor didn't let it sit unanswered. She told the court she didn't believe him, that his behavior throughout the case showed a man who understood exactly what he'd done and felt little real remorse for it. The judge sentenced him to 20 years, the maximum allowed on the single charge he'd actually been convicted of, while stating on the record that he was weighing the murder confession alongside it, even though no separate sentence for that crime would ever exist. With good behavior, Heinrich could become eligible for release in as little as 17 years. The plea agreement does preserve the state's ability to pursue civil commitment as a sexual predator once his prison term ends, which means his confinement may not fully end when his sentence does, even if his legal accountability for Jacob's death effectively already has. There was no other verdict to deliver. There never would be. He was 11 years old. He liked riding bikes with his brother and his best friend. He'd just picked up a comedy from the video store and was most of the way home when a man stepped out of the dark holding a gun. He asked the only question that made sense to ask a stranger doing something incomprehensible to him. What did I do wrong? There was no wrong. There never was. In the months after Jacob disappeared, before there was any answer at all, his parents started building something out of the not knowing. What began as a small foundation in his name became, over the following decades, the driving force behind some of the most significant child safety legislation in the country. Minnesota passed its own sex offender registry law in 1991. 3 years later, Congress passed a federal law bearing Jacob's name, the first in the nation requiring every state to maintain a registry of convicted sex offenders, laying the groundwork for further legislation that followed it in the years after. Jacob's mother also helped bring Minnesota's version of the Amber Alert system into existence. It's worth saying plainly that her original vision was narrower than what these laws eventually became, a quiet, limited tool for law enforcement, not the sprawling public system it grew into over time. She's said in interviews that she doesn't look at the public registries much anymore, but the instinct underneath all of it, that something like this should never be allowed to disappear into silence again, never changed. A man was identified within 48 hours of Jacob's abduction. Investigators had his name, a matching vehicle, matching footprints, matching tire tracks, and somehow let all of it go for 27 years, while an innocent man's name and his family's farm were dragged through the same suspicion in the meantime. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't come through a trial or a jury. It came through a negotiated deal that traded justice in its usual form for the only thing that mattered more in that moment, to the people who'd waited 27 years for it. If you have kids who bike or walk anywhere alone, even somewhere familiar, it's worth having the conversation about what to do if a stranger ever approaches, and making sure they know it's always okay to scream, to run, to fight, and to tell you everything afterward, no matter what they were told to keep quiet. And if this case teaches anything at all, let it be this. A tip that seems small, given quickly, can matter more than anyone realizes at the time. Don't let 3 months go by on something that showed up in the first 48 hours. If this one stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment hit hardest. Hit subscribe if you're new. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one, and we'll see you in the next case.